Okay, so video 4 is an introduction to working with guides and grids. So there's quite a few different ways that you can look at a grid design, but you certainly should be thinking about your grid for your layouts. It brings a lot of consistency to your work. And a grid is just a way of making sure that we're not just kind of randomly choosing anywhere on our screen to just pop down our layout elements. We kind of want to think about a grid as being something that keeps things aligned and just makes it easier to make those choices. But you don't want your grid to be so restrictive that you can't move within it, and that you don't have any options from a layout from creativity perspective. But a grid is a combination of white space, colored or just kind of background elements that are not the focus, some type, which is generally your focus, or maybe an image or a couple of images. But grids can really help make the most of those elements. A lot of times we're working with columns and rows, and we want to bring some consistency across our layouts. So I'm going to go up here to what's called the master style. Okay, so we can edit the master style. So you notice here in the pages, this says A. That's A master applied. So by default, out of the gate, A master has nothing on it because I haven't set any styles. But a master grid is sort of like a template that it's sort of like a paragraph style. This is a page style that applies to the page, and you can make multiple master styles, but they're a little more visual in terms of layout and stuff like this. So this is where we do things like page numbering, but it's also where we typically set up and design our grids and our guides. So I'm just going to go and turn on the basic document grid. Okay, so the default document grid is 1 inch. Every inch it's got a kind of a darker indicator divided into 8, 1/8, right, if we're using the imperial system. So, out of the gate, that's what your default grid looks like. So it lines up pretty decently because 8.5 by 11, that works out to a nice 17 grid across the column. We have our rulers turned on generally by default. I'm not even sure if you can turn your rulers off. Yeah, you can. But most of the time your rulers should be showing. InDesign is all about rules and layouts and page measurements and all those things. So we're going to want our rulers on. But more than that, we are going to need to use our rulers to drag guides and things around to work out our spacing. But right now what I've got is a really basic 8.5 by 11 with a 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch bleed. I haven't set any margins or anything. So this middle purple line here, that's the fold. That's represented there in this spread. But right now I'm in editing mode of the A master. That's why it's highlighted. So, I could look at this and say, okay, well, my margin, maybe I just want a basic 1/2 inch margin all the way around, and that's fine. But it's actually somewhat uncommon to have the interior margin of a folded page spread be the same as your exterior margin. You generally want a little more space, and sometimes you want more in the footer, less in the header, whatever. That's all kind of up to your individual ideas for how your layout's going to look. But the first thing off the gate is we can sort of look at this and sort of go, well, by default, where is this measuring from? Because notice that it doesn't just end at 8.5. It actually goes 9/10. It doesn't start at 8.5 again. So the first thing we kind of want to do in a spread layout is take our origin for our rulers. So you can click in this upper left-hand crosshair here. It's kind of subtle, but it's right where the vertical and the horizontal rulers meet. And you can notice that there's numbers count up, so they go negative off 0. So we can take our origin and snap it down in the middle of our spread. So that's going to then work out the same from the middle so that our grid can kind of work both ways, right? We don't want it to kind of cross over and be half grid here and on one side of our spread and not half on the other. So putting our origin at our measurement origin at the spread kind of splits our grid evenly between our two pages. So that's kind of our first easy thing to do. So we also want to always have snap to document grid turned on, because it's very rare that we would want anything placed just sort of slightly off our grid. We want to use our grid. And the grid has fairly fine spacing. I mean, it's not too fine, you know, it's just right now it's just 1/8 of an inch at the default, and that's okay. But if I put down a text block within that, you know, it's always gonna fit on my grid, and got my type in there. Let's apply the paragraph style, basic paragraph. Okay, and you know, that's basically on my grid, but we're also using the grid for things like spacing between shapes. Let's say we put down a bunch of graphic objects. Let's just quickly make one there for ourselves. So we use our grid to determine something like, okay, well, what's my kind of minimum space between images? So we might say it's 1 subunit, whatever that might be. So in this case, 1/8 of an inch on our grid, but that's pretty default. I kind of like to give myself a slightly finer grid like that. But on the other hand, I also don't really like having to do the math in my head of what, you know, 7/8 is in fractions. You know, I know it's 875 or whatever. Or do I? I don't know. Again, it's just kind of hard to divide by 8 all the time and convert to fractions. So there is a kind of a little hacky workaround, because at the end of the day, this is just relative rules. There's no rule that says we need to use 8 subdivisions. That's just the default. So I like to divide my inches into tenths. It's easy to divide by 10. So I'm just going to go to my file, edit, preferences. Okay, and then we're going to go to grids. And we can see right here we got our baseline, top edge. I mean, I don't really use the baseline grid that often, but you could. This main grid is just a little more useful because it's columns and rows. Just change it from 8 to 10. Plain and simple. And, you know, grids and back, typically we want that, unless we're putting down a background color all the time, in which case we want our grids to sit over top of things. But, you know, light gray grid in back by default, that's pretty decent. Everybody's got their preferences there. You can totally customize it, but the default gray is pretty good. So I'm just going to leave that at subdivisions of 10. So it just made everything a little smaller in my grid. But now it's going to be kind of easy. Like, let's say I wanted to create a block of text that has a background color. Okay, so well, let's just select our type tool since it's unassigned, so turn it into a type box. I'm going to fill this with some text. Okay, my basic paragraph style. But I want it to have a background color. But I don't want my type running right up against the edge of that grid. So what I can do is I can now start to style up this text block a little bit. So you can right click and then go text frame options. And then you can set your inset spacing, and you can set things like column numbers and all that sort of stuff. But inset spacing, if I just increment up or down like this, the default is going to be that, you know, fractions of an inch that aren't super easy, like 0.1875, 0.25, you know, the 1/8. I prefer to be able to just kind of do that in my head. So now I can just say, well, one unit is just 0.1. It's just cleaner and easier, right? I mean, you can use the 8 grid because it's default, but it's just kind of defaulty. So I'm just kind of customizing things, right? And similarly, if I want to do I'm not going to get column yet. And let's say I just want to center that type in there so it just kind of fits. So because I've customized my grid, it's just kind of easy for me to increment up and down by, you know, 0.1, 0.2, and it's all going to still align on my grid. So I kind of like that, and it just looks a little less defaulted. But I think there's actually a way to change the auto increment amount, but I'm not going to waste time farting around with that in this video, but most of the time you're just going to leave that alone. So that would be one of the main reasons that you want to set your grid that way. It's just kind of easier to set your spacing and divide in tenths than it is by 8s, personally. Okay, so we've got our basic document grid, and we now kind of have starting to get an idea of what our kind of how fine we want our grid to be. And I think that this is going to work for most layouts. It's pretty small amounts of spacing. So now the next thing is I want to go through and define some margins. So I can go into layout and I can go to margin and columns. Okay, so this is where you can choose your top, bottom, inside, outside. Okay, so inside and outside refers to both sides of the spread. So if I wanted to set my inside margin to 1 inch and my outside margin to 0.5, I would unclick that little link there. Okay, so that's now allows my outside margin to be different size than my inside margin. Still lines up with my columns. I now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns. It's not bad. I mean, I'm not going to use, I actually don't use my grid to define my columns anyways. So we then might say, and let's give ourselves less space at the bottom. The bottom is 0.5. So if we zoom out a little, we can kind of see our sort of main area for our content that's outside of the margin that we're going to keep most of our content within is kind of set up like that. So let's go and put our kind of working text elements in there. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing. And here's something too that you'll notice is that InDesign, you know, smart guides and snapping, it's not, if you're zoomed out, it's not quite perfect. It seems to work a little better if you actually grab a handle. It'll snap onto it, but if you're just kind of dragging the whole object around, sometimes it won't snap. But you just got to either just be aware of that, or often one of the things I do, sort of a bit of a quality control when I'm working on it, is go and say, okay, well, there we go. Oh, I have my baseline grid on there. So, I mean, you can use your baseline grid. I don't know necessarily what the point really is. Just helps you visualize your basic spacing, and it's kind of saying, well, this is the minimum row size, so obviously you go and edit your baseline grid to line up with your document grid. But I say, why even bother? Just turn off the baseline grid. I mean, you can use auto alignment that would rely on that, but I'm not going to bother with it. This is the most basic grid, doesn't need that, so hide baseline. Because really, your document grid is doing the job for you there in terms of giving you something to align with. But it's just kind of guides that go right across your spread. So there's times you might want to use that. But this is what all I use. Okay, so this is a basic, I've sort of defined now what a full column is. So if you go through and look at most magazines, you're going to see a combination of a couple of sort of blocks of text styles. And I'm just going to overset these. It's fine. So this is a single column. And actually what I'm doing here is I'm holding down the Alt key with the direct selection, with the selection arrow, because that turns into a duplicate. So if you hold down Alt, you get this little double arrow. Click your mouse, click and drag. And that's going to duplicate the object. Let go of the mouse, that duplicates it, and then let go of the Alt key, and then there you go, you've got your duplicate. That's just to save time, so I don't have to click and fill with placeholder text every time. So this is a single column. I'm going to do a 2 column. Text frame options again, so just click that up to 2. And then I'm going to do a 3 column. Okay, so this is how we get that multi-column text. We don't need to do multiple text boxes. You can sort of divide text blocks into columns. But when I zoom in a little close, you know, the default gutter space, that's how wide this is, you know, because based on the 1/8 grid by default isn't lining up with my more custom 1/10 grid. So I'm just going to right click for text frame options again, and I'm going to just change my gutter to 0.2. So that's going to align my my size on my grid. And then similarly here for a 3 column, because this isn't going to divide as evenly because we've got an uneven number at 1 inch, right? So it's not going to, we don't necessarily want to be balancing or unbalancing our grid size. So there's a couple of things that you can do. There's different ways. This is kind of an aesthetic design choice to some degree. You can say balance columns and then set this to 2. Okay, so that's just going to force that. Or you could turn off balance columns and set just set your column width gutter depending on what your various measurement is. But for the full column, it divides pretty reasonably there. But I typically will turn on balanced columns. Just kind of sets your spacing a little better. But that's kind of up to you. So there we go. I've got my 2-column split, my single column, and a 3-column. That's typically enough, but sometimes we want 4. So I'm also going to duplicate over here. I'm just going to get this out of the way because it's kind of in the way. And I'm going to now change this to 4 columns. And that's about as narrow as you get. Some publications you will see an even narrower sub-column. You know, it's not going to split too evenly at 5, but you could do it. But, you know, 6 works. It's pretty narrow. So you could, but then we're almost getting into dividing our column grid up into pretty fine increments. Totally up to you. There's a time and a place, but really what you can see is that makes a 1-inch column with the standard spacing. So that's pretty easy to remember, I think. So I wouldn't bother going quite that fine. I think a 4-column grid with 2-column spacing is fine. Although I'm pretty sure if I go 1, it doesn't line up on the grid. Yeah. Yeah, 0.2 works in this case. This is going to be different depending on each page size, of course. So you got to work out your grids based on how big your page is, but this is pretty standard for an 11 by 17. Okay, so those are now my styles. So where do the guides come into play, right? Because you'll notice that now my column grid does not really line up with my document grid. I mean, everything will snap, but that isn't where my column definitions are. They aren't 1 inch strictly. And I don't want them to be. I mean, I could if I wanted to divide that way, but that just makes, you know, divide by 3, divide by 4 kind of works out a little differently. So I'm going to drag in my column guides. So this is kind of, again, a personal choice. You can either put it right in the middle of the gutter, just makes kind of simpler, which I sometimes like to do, or sometimes I like to actually mark out the spacing. But most of the time I'm defining that space with the object style, right? So all I really care about is just defining that line there. So I've got my first grid, which is the default cyan guide. So I've dragged those across now. Because what I'm going to ultimately do is, because I've got document grid snapping turned on, I'm going to hide my document grid so that stuff's just going to kind of snap to it, but I am going to want to be able to visualize my column grids in terms of how I'm doing it. So I could put all these, I could mix my 3-column guides, 4 columns, all onto one single master style if I wanted to. That might be the case. I don't find that I'm often blending my column types too much on one layout. Typically kind of like to break it into a couple of different master style guides. So I'm just going to call my A master A as my basic 4-column breakout, and that's probably going to work for me most of the time. But there's going to be cases where I'm going to want to do a 2 and a 3. And I mean, 2, you obviously don't need a guide for 2 columns because it's just in the middle of the page, so that guide is there. You don't really want to do that. But this 1/3 grid guide, you kind of do. That's not so easy to spot, right? So we just want to make it easy if we're going to do a layout that uses a 1/3. So now that I've got all these guides, or I've got my 3 guides there, I'm just going to hold down, I'm going to drag and select all of them. You can select them like objects. Hold down the Alt key again to duplicate and just drag them over and line them up on the grid, which is right there. Or sorry, not there, right there. Because I just want it on both sides of my master style. So now that all I've literally used is I've used Adobe's InDesign's built-in column tool to spec out my grid. You could do it without using that, but this is just more visual, easier way to do it. You can sit down with a calculator and just work out the spacing if you like, but I find it's just kind of nice and easy to make the column. It's there. So depends. I mean, you now have got these grids. Maybe the cyan doesn't stand out so well to you. You can right click on these and just go ruler guides, and then you can change the color here. So if you want something that stands out a little better to your eye or whatever. So sometimes I kind of want to make these look like they're part of the margin. I don't know. It's totally personal choice, but sometimes I'll edit it to something a little easier to look at, like the light blue. But the point is I kind of like my different guide grids to be different colors just so I can differentiate them a little more easily. So, you know, that's my master 4-column grid. So let's go back to pages. So A master A, which is applied to everything automatically, those guides are now available on every page that uses that style. But like I said, I also want to do a 3-column template. So, you know, this is where we make a new master style. So I just duplicate spread A master. It's going to call that B master. I'm going to double click in here, and now I'm going to change these to 3-column and make them a different color. And oh, it's not locked them. Good. Okay, so just grab a text block, drag them across, right click, text frame options, 3 columns, put my gutter to 2. Everything should line up on the grid nice and easy. I now no longer, I mean, sometimes you kind of want your middle guide to show, but in the 3-column I find that a little confusing personally, so I just delete this guy. Okay, and I'm going to change it to the magenta to match my margin there. It's just going to help it stand out visually on the layout. I mean, you could leave them blue. I don't know, because I'm not using a mixed grid. I guess that's more something I would do when I'm mixing my grids on one layout, which I'm not going to do here. So let's just delete the ones that were in my duplicate and duplicate this over to the other side of the spread, which is right there. Kind of double check to make sure I didn't put on the wrong grid point. Let's all line up. Yep, we're good to go. Okay, so there we go. So your vertical, sometimes you sort of want to define the vertical middle of the page. I don't know, with a basic grid like this, I think it's pretty straightforward and easy to see. But if you had like a consistent place where you want to drop a header down to or whatever, then you could put a guide across there, and that'll apply, you know, across the board. One last thing with guides, if you don't want a guide, say you want your left-hand side of your spread to have a vertical location that's consistent, let's say a place where we're always going to end our cover page, let's say we always want that to be on the right-hand side. If I drag a guide down and into the page, notice how it only applies to that page, but if I drag outside of the guide, it goes right across the spread. So if you put a guide on your spread, it applies to the whole spread. Put it on the page, it just applies to that page. So that's how you can have a different mixed vertical grid across, or guides across the plane, but that's not always that big of a deal, but sometimes you want to do that. Okay, so that is now B master. So say I'm like, well, I actually want to use on this side, I want this side to be a 4-column spread, this side to be a 3-column spread. I can now grab this, select it, and it's going to now change my grid. So that's sort of like a mixed spread, that 3 columns on one side, 4 columns on the other. That's quite common in different layouts. So there you go. You got your basic grids and your guides set up, and you're pretty much ready now to start doing your layouts and applying styles and stuff. So after this, the next video that I'm going to go through in class 2 is object styling. So saving those preset gutter sizes for your different column blocks so that you can quickly select them from your object styles and float your text. Then we're going to get into more advanced stuff like Pantone, proper color Pantone swatches, linking files, that sort of stuff. More individual layout things, but these are the fundamentals getting going with your InDesign grid. If you start to apply these things to most of your work, you're going to get you're going to see some more consistent. You're going to feel like you get more consistent layout work within your designs.